You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this masterclass. Just to give you a bit of an overview, there are 3 sections. So the first section is the original discussion from the first podcast that I did with Oscar. Then you have a recording of your responses to what we said, and an invitation to experiment where Shani and Oscar and I reflect on the responses to the original episode. This whole thing is over 2 hours long, and there are many ways that you can listen to it. So you can watch the video, or you can listen to the audio, or you can do both. You can watch and listen in one sitting. You can watch and listen to each section, pausing, noticing, reflecting, noting with 1 or 2 days until your next listen to the next session, to let the learning emerge slowly. Or you might want to watch or listen together with someone else. That might be somebody at work, it might be someone you work with, it might be another coach, either at the same time or during the same week. Using this technique, you're going to help each other hear and discover something new about listening, something varied and something different. Watch and listen to what's said and notice how it's being said. Taking notes or not taking notes, whichever works for you, whether it's words or icons, diagrams or something else, might be a useful way of engaging. And of course, we will really look forward to hearing your feedback and finding out how you're using this and what you're learning, because we're still learning too. Thank you.
You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
I'm here to listen.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm your host, Claire Pedrick. Today I'm in conversation with Oscar Trimboli in Australia. I was introduced to Oscar by Shaney Crawford, who sent me a message on LinkedIn and went, "You have to meet this man. He has to come to the Coaching Inn." So welcome, Oscar.
Thank you, Shani, and thank you, Claire. I'm looking forward to listening to your questions today.
Well, and thank you for the copies of the book that you've sent to me, which we'll be sharing with listeners who you and I can work out together how we're going to share them with our listeners. But really great to have a look at your book. So I love it. Oscar's book is called How to Listen, and there are sound bites in it that sound like they've come from me, which I love because I always like it when I agree with somebody's book. I love the bit about seeing and hearing and sensing. But my question to you is, what started you out in the journey to listening?
You have to kind of go to April 2008. I'm in a boardroom at Microsoft. We were on a video conference, 18 people across Sydney, Seattle, and Singapore. And there's a lot of people in the room. Lots of people with laptops furiously doing unnatural things to Excel to try and bend budgets into political context, growth context, market context. And the meeting's supposed to go for 90 minutes. And at the 20-minute mark, my vice president, my boss, Tracy, looks me straight in the eye across the boardroom table and says, "Oscar, we need to talk immediately after this meeting." So, Claire, from that moment on, I did not listen to another word in what happened in the budget meeting, because the only thing that was going through my head was, I'm about to get fired. How many weeks of salary have I got left? And who are the 5 people I need to call to kind of find paid employment? I think the answer was 8 weeks salary. And by some miracle of nature, the meeting finished at the 70-minute mark, not 90. And everybody kind of packed up their equipment and started to head out of the room. And Tracy said, "Oscar, make sure you close the door, because what I have to say to you is very important." And I went, "Oh, great." And as I stepped back only halfway towards the boardroom table, Tracy said to me, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And I thought, I'm getting fired and I don't even know why. And I sat down and Tracy said to me, "Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world." What I heard was, woohoo, I hadn't been fired. And honestly, I didn't think anything of this listening stuff for about 3 weeks because I'd got this huge uplift in my budget because I didn't pay attention. And then the chief financial officer asked me to come and audit his listening in his team meeting, to which I agreed. And I started to take notes and I realized, oh, I'm coding how to listen. The difference between hearing and listening is action. I hope I've honored Tracy. And, we've got 32,000 people who've participated in our research study about what gets in their way when it comes to listening. We've coded it into jigsaw puzzle games and we've coded it into 100-odd episodes of podcasts. We've coded it into 3 books. Tracy did want me to code it into software and that'll be the next step in the journey. So that's how I got started, Claire. I thought I was getting fired. And for leaders out there who might be listening or coaches, what you say and what they hear are 2 completely different things, as I proved.
Yes. I love that story on many levels.
Oh, which level should we chat about? There are other backstories in my migrant heritage. There are backstories in growing up in and going to a school with 23 nationalities. There are stories about how I would have team meetings in our contact center at Microsoft and everybody had to listen to customer calls for an hour before we came in. There's many stories, but I think that's the moment where I went, oh, okay, this is something I can go towards rather than go away from.
It's the irony that makes me smile, that your breakthrough in listening came through when you didn't listen. Nice.
Life has a way of teaching us things in ways we don't anticipate. And I think I think my lesson was the curiosity when Brian, the CFO, asked me, "Hey, can you come and listen to my team meeting?" And there's a whole backstory there where I fought him for about 3 times in our communication. But he said to me, "Hey, Oscar, I can't fix the top line of your budget, but we can invest for growth." And he was speaking my language then. And I went, oh, okay, if he's going to invest for growth, the least I can do is go and audit his listening. So, that's where the journey started. And where are we at? 2008. Yeah, we're a good nearly 15 years down the track now.
So what did audit listening look like, sound like, feel like?
It was an A4 piece of paper. And when I started off, what I always do in group context is I map the room, like literally where is everybody sitting on a piece of paper. If you speak, you get a dot. If you ask a question, you get a question mark. And if you ask a clarifying question, you get an upside down question mark. And what I notice is where's the gravity? So that map will really quickly show you that who's not being listened to, who's not speaking up in that map that we draw. And what I also map is each third or quarter of the meeting. So if it's a half an hour meeting, we'll map each 10 minutes. And if it's a 1 hour meeting, we will map each 15 minutes. And what I map is how many people haven't spoken at each of those time sequences and see if that number's static or increases or is complete by the time the conversation completes. The other thing I was auditing back then was how long or short the question is, meaning sometimes they ask double barrel, triple barrel questions and you just kind of like, I'm not even sure what the question is, let alone the answer. So I was always curious who attempted to answer it versus who who wanted to clarify, did you mean the first bit, the second bit, the third bit? How's A, B, and C connected, or is that, and those kinds of things. So that is how, in a very rudimentary way, we noticed, or I noticed, because Tracy said to me, if you could code how I listen. And what I did very quickly was, okay, so what does the literature say, whether that's academic or practitioner literature, about how people listen? If I get into a topic, I go pretty deep pretty quick. And there didn't seem to be a deep overlap between practitioner orientations and academic orientations. Academic orientations tend to come from a therapeutic, psychology, psychiatry, some modality that was from a therapy rather than necessarily a commercial or organizational outcome. And I speculate, my hypothesis is that listening needs to progress rather than just being what people might see in a Netflix video of what a psychologist or a psychiatrist get. Because I always joke to people, listening in the workplace is not therapy. And if you're trying to do therapy, you're not serving yourself or them unless you're certified. And if you're certified in therapy, then you'll be choiceful in whether that's useful or not. But in exploring all the literature, there's talk about listening being situational, relational, contextual. It's such a dynamic orientation you have to be about listening. And in the book, we talk about it, what distinguishes good listeners from great listeners is their situational and relational flexibility, their orientation to notice what's going to be useful, not just for the other, but for the system or the group that they're operating in. And for me, my nerdy parts, that was the fun in doing, nearly 1,000 qualitative surveys and reviewing them line by line in spreadsheets, and the quantitative. And my favorite statistic is 3/4 of people think they're well above or above average listeners. But if you ask the question the other way, as a speaker, how would you rate the other people's listening? Only 12% of them rate somebody above or well above average when it comes to listening. So there's a very different self-awareness because we don't have, as we do in math, we have 4 operators: add, divide, subtract, and multiply. It's really clear. And in language context, whether that's English or other languages, we have syntax that helps us. In music, there's sheet music and the way notes work together. In chemistry, we have the periodic table of elements. In communication, there's nothing as concrete as that. So it's little wonder we're not great at listening.
So many. How long have you got?
As my wife says, Oscar, you could talk about listening for the rest of your life. I said, well, that's the plan.
Yes. I've been doing some work around the sound of conversations and the sound of how people pass from one to the other. And I'm definitely going to go away and think about your dots and your upside down question marks.
Yeah, I've got a little video that I talk over. I'll share that with you. That's got an example of that happening over time, where I'm coding a theoretical conversation. Tell me more about the sound of conversation. I'm fascinated.
It connects to what you've said in your book. So for me, there's something about the offer, about the handing over the conversation from the listener to the facilitator of the conversation hands the conversation over to the other person as they listen, and then only takes it back when that's appropriate. So you've got a bit in your book about okay not being a great way of responding. And okay isn't a great way of responding for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons I noticed from watching lots and lots of recordings of dialogues in gallery view, so you can see the eyes of both people, and so you can watch the toing and froing. Offering sounds sound like a comma. So, and, so they leave the sound with the other person, whereas okay is a stopping sound. So if I say, okay, you're going to go, she's waiting to say something else. And there's some really simple and very interesting stuff about the music of coaching. And I'm just about to engage in dialogue with a musician who takes notes about conversations like you do, and completely differently from how you do, I'm sure, to see what that can teach us.
Can we kind of play with something together?
Please.
I have a sense, and if I won a lottery and had the opportunity to do a PhD, this is what I'd do it in. I sense that people who have a second language listen with a different granularity to people who are only dialoguing in one language, and they've only ever had one language. And I want to be careful about how I explain a language. So a language may be music, a language may be math, a language may be chemistry, and a language may be your native tongue as well. And because of where I'm located, and no doubt where you're located as well, we operate across multiple cultures, we operate across multiple contexts, and people who may not have the same home language that we speak in a dialogue. And often I'm in situations, particularly in group work, where the person is struggling to find the words in the system language. Typically it's English, but it may not be. It may be French, particularly in global NGOs and sporting systems and all of that, French and Spanish and other languages. And when I'm in that situation and the person is struggling, I ask them to pause, collect their thoughts, and then say it in their home language. Because once they do, they sense it very differently, and they find the spoken language system words really quickly. So, because they go and connect with the feeling of when they said that before. But I also believe, like sedimentary rock in an archaeology dig, because you've got these extra layers through other language context, you listen in a completely different way. That's my speculation. What do you hear? What do you see? What do you feel when I say that?
I think that's so interesting. I'm just thinking about watching people listening in languages I don't understand. I'm also thinking, as you're talking, about if we listen so that the other person understands, which is often the purpose of listening. That's a beautiful description, because they don't need to be speaking the same language as us to understand it. So that makes me think about that. And the other thing it makes me think about is if really deep listening is about what we see and hear and sense, we can see and hear and sense when we don't understand what they're saying anyway. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and in the book, there's an example where somebody says to me, "Be prepared, I'm just going to vomit on you." And they did. And it went for about 25 minutes where I was literally present. But halfway through, there was a shift in their body state. And I could have missed it if I was just fixated on the words, but there was a shift. And when they complete, they go, "Oh, wow, glad I got that out." And I said, "Oh, I just noticed something about halfway through." And they go, "Oh, what did you notice?" I said, "Oh, your body shifted and you did this." And they go, "Yeah, that's when I decided I'm sick of my own excuses and I actually made a decision." And I thought, wow, if they didn't have that reflected back to them, how more convicted they were about that decision with somebody else noticing. Meaning that as we work with people, when they feel seen, heard, and valued, it's because you've listen to what they think and what they mean, not what they've said. What they've said is a series of ingredients. What matters is the recipe and the menu that ultimately that places. And that's why I think for people who have multiple languages, they just have this incredible richness that someone like me, who has a monolingual approach, can never seek to understand. Although both my stepchildren went on exchange and had to learn German and French and later Hindi, and I see how they process the world differently. But they process the world differently because they learnt music first, and that gave them a way to think about learning a language that wasn't something that they grew up with and their parents and their extended family taught them. So I have these, the sedimentary rock matters to me. I often want to go a lot further down into the layers that people may be staying at the surface on.
What a beautiful story. The vomiting for 20-minute person.
That was their words, not mine. And they said, put your hazmat suit on, which was pre-COVID days too. So it always sticks in my head. And the example I was thinking about, the person in the most recent example was speaking in Hebrew, and their language flow in a written format goes from left to right, not from right to left, not left to right. And I often wonder with Sanskrit and with Japanese and other languages where the orientation is very different, how much nuance we miss because we have a language orientation from an individual perspective rather than a collective perspective. As an example, when you look at multi-layered cultures that are high context cultures like the Japanese or the Korean or the Chinese or the indigenous Aboriginal communities of Australia as an example as well. I have lots that the aunties and uncles have taught me about their ways of dadiri, which means listen to your lands, listen to your people, and listen to yourself. The thing they talk about is, Oscar, it's not those separate parts. It's all completely integrated. You can't think of one without the other two. And again, in my way of thinking, I value the deconstruction because then it makes sense to me. But in collective cultures, it's the integrity and the integration of all of those things that we necessarily unconscious of when we're listening across cultures that we need to be much more conscious of, particularly to check in for what they heard rather than what we said.
Just made sense of something. Thank you.
Say more.
So we have run some of our training in Australia. So we have Australians on lots of our training, but some of our training we've run in Australian time. And working with a colleague who is in Australia, we felt that we should respect that it was an Australian course, even though people were on it globally, because it was in Australian time. So we used the acknowledgement of the lands and the context that is used in Australia, respecting those who've come before. And it made something different for delegates from other places. So we still do that. So I'm running a course at the moment, doesn't have any Australians on it. It's slightly different because we've taken out, especially the peoples of, which was in the acknowledgement that we used when we were running it in Australia. But I think there's been something different about those courses because I wonder what, because I'm just thinking. You're a very good listener, by the way. We're encouraging everybody to acknowledge conversations and systems and everything that have come before, in a very human way, because you can get very organizational development about systems, can't you? But there's a humanity.
Yes, the north system, the south system, the west system, and all those other kind of mechanical overlays. And yet our organizational systems are nothing more than the oral traditions that we pass on through the culture, which is no different from 60,000 years of dreaming. And the wonderful gift that my Indigenous brothers and sisters give us to go, the story helps you make sense of your past, your present, and your future, and how you and those around you fit into that. And the best storytelling cultures are the best listening cultures, because they're training multiple generations on how to be present, to listen to their elders. And in the context I'm talking about, our Indigenous communities in Australia and our Maori cousins and our Polynesian cousins, there is a tuning that the elders do to bring silence to the circle before it commences, and it's much longer than what you would at the commencement of any meeting in an organizational system, because they're bringing the presence of history and the stories they're going to tell from the past, which have all been handed down. And in organizational systems, I think we get overly sophisticated, where we're trying to map it and put it into software and create hierarchies or diagrams. And the only way you make sense of all of that is the tradition of telling stories. And the tradition in a workplace is, how do things get done here? Why do people get promoted? Why do people get fired? They're all stories. You can put all the organizational values you want on the wall, yet a story brings them to life and helps people understand how it makes sense. So I'm very grateful. I'm on Wadamadagal country, and it's a river system. And there's an additional element of the lands that the aunties and uncles have taught me about, the traditions of the fish and how they keep the lands for the next generation. And I think in organizational systems, we orientate closely to the present and we forget our past and our future. And we miss a big opportunity. The flip side is, if you look at the really high-performing systems in terms of financial ROI, they always have longevity in the leadership team. They're not swapping them out all the time. And it's those ones that swap it out all the time because they're only in the present. They're not acknowledging past and future. There's a sense, a tradition that they're not listening to in the past or for in the future. So, yeah, I'm delighted that it's helped you make sense of what's really powerful. The Inuit communities in North America, the Eskimo communities, have these traditions as well. The tribal elders in the Amazon and in the first tribes, particularly that I'm aware of in Tanzania and the communities around that, they have great traditions where silence is a sign of wisdom, respect, and authority. Whereas in the West, silence is a cue to lack of understanding, insight, quality, speed, whatever they may overlay on that. But it's a false overlay. We have all this negative language around silence that's called the awkward silence, the pregnant pause, the deafening silence. There's no language in an English context that showcases and gives honor to the power of silence. It's continuously viewed in a context that's not productive.
I agree. And when I was writing, I've just got another book out called The Human Behind the Coach, which I co-wrote with Lucia Baldelli. And we've got a chapter in there about silence. And one of the things that I felt really strongly needed to be in the chapter on silence was that just because you're not talking doesn't mean it's silence. And you've just described cultures who in their tradition have got a deep silence, not just an I'm not talking silence.
And I'll bring in the meta point. So I'll give you a really simple example. I'm part of a process where I'm handing over some work to other people, and tomorrow they will be presenting. I've set them up for success. I'm very comfortable that they're going to do an amazing job. And on Friday, I just sent both of them a text and said, "Do you want me to be present?" And the reply back from both of them near instantaneously was, "No, we don't want you to present. We are presenting." And I went back and I said, "Okay." We had a phone call today and I said, "Is there anything else I can do to set you up to be successful tomorrow?" And they said, no, we're great. We're all good. I said, just last Friday, I sent you a text that said, "Do you want me to be present?" And you came back and said, "No, I'm okay to present." I said, "My only invitation for you and my wish is that tomorrow when you present, you are present." And we had a very long laugh about that.
That's going to make it into a book, isn't it?
Maybe not. Claire, earlier on you said, "Oh, you're a good listener." Or what am I doing that's signaling that to you? Because not everyone can see us.
We're co-creating this conversation. So I'm listening to you and you're listening to me. Mm-hmm. And some things are emerging from that space. And can I be really honest? Not everybody engages in podcasts like that when they're a guest.
Meaning a two-way dialogue.
Yeah, else. Yeah, because if you've come to promote your whatever.
Yep.
The quality that comes out of the co-creation, that comes out of the silence, isn't always present.
And if you imagine a couple of people who listen, what do you think they're taking away from our conversation if they were kind of going to summarize it in a sentence? Or
answer that, or I could respond to what I've just noticed. I'm going to answer your question, but I am going to just make an observation. I don't think you know what you're going to say next. I think that that's the listening is demonstrated in the responding to what's emerging. If that there's a tiny little answer to your question. What do we think?
And I think it answers both questions to some extent too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But you're going to build, so let me not interrupt.
Well, my build is to encourage the listeners to build, actually. And to join in the conversation.
So because what should they email to you? And we've got some books to give away.
We have got some books to give away. I think I would love to hear from listeners. What's your biggest insight from this? Not from what we've said, but from what you've built out of what we've said. So no books if you say, Oscar said this. So that's the task. Are we in agreement, Oscar?
Kinda.
Build.
No, clarification.
Yeah.
If you were to say that again for the audience, what is your expectation that they would email you? You've been very clear on what not to say.
Email us info@3dcoaching.com with the heading listening. And we would love to hear one thing that you know now that you didn't know before as a result of something that you've built out of this conversation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
For me.
And I've got some lovely copies to send out.
As you can see, Claire, I could talk about this for the rest of my life. And my wish for all of these conversations is that hosts notice that I'm just present to the dialogue. And thanks to Dame Evelyn Glennie, somebody from the north of England who I interviewed, profoundly deaf. She taught me how to listen with my whole body. It took a while, but when I listen, even through a mediated environment like the video that we're on right now, when I bring my presence and I connect my whole being to the conversation, yes, listening is a skill. Yes, listening is a strategy. Yes, listening is a practice. But for me, when I'm being listening, I can change many perspectives. And the most important one is to change my own. So when I always leave these conversations with my perspective changed, and the perspective you change for me is to reinforce and continue this curiosity about the role of language as a way to unlock more potent ways of listening. When by being present to you, Claire, you change me, I know it's a great conversation. So thanks for listening.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you everyone for listening. And Oscar's book is How to Listen, Discover the Hidden Key to Better Communication. So get those emails coming in. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.
If you didn't listen to the original episode, we'd love you to share your reflection via email using the subject listen. Just send it to info@3dcoaching.com. What you're going to hear next is us recognising the importance of you being able to hear all the responses. This is about us acknowledging the part others have played and also role modelling that we are listening and always stuff to learn. So thank you to Agnes, to Anya, Joanne, Josephine, Julian, Lizzie, Manjit, Naomi, Nathan, Penny, Sarah, Shankar, Sue, Vardeep and Wendy. And everyone else who thought about responding and didn't. This section is 45 minutes long, and we invite you to note and notice what's similar and what's different from these listeners' reflections to yours, or indeed to something else. Make it your own and let us know what you're learning. Thank you.
And if you imagine a couple of people you know who listen, what do you think they're taking away from our conversation if they were kind of going to summarize it in a sentence? Or
To answer that, or I could respond to what I've just noticed. I'm going to answer your question, but I am going to just make an observation. I don't think you know what you're going to say next. I think that that's the listening is demonstrated in the responding to what's emerging. if that does a tiny little answer to your question. What do we think?
And I think it answers both questions to some extent too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But you're going to build, so let me not interrupt.
Well, my build is to encourage the listeners to build, actually. And to join in the conversation.
What should they email to you? And we've got some books to give away.
We have got some books to give away. I think I would love to hear from listeners. What's your biggest insight from this? Not from what we've said, but from what you've built out of what we've said. So no books if you say, Oscar said this. So that's the task. Are we in agreement, Oscar?
Kinda.
Build.
No, clarification.
Yeah.
If you were to say that again for the audience, what is your expectation that they would email you? You've been very clear on what not to say.
Email us info@3dcoaching.com with the heading listening. And we would love to hear one thing that you know now that you didn't know before as a result of something that you've built out of this conversation.
Hello, Claire. Hello, Oscar. Thank you for the opportunity to eavesdrop on your conversation at the Coaching Inn on how to listen. And thank you for the opportunity to respond. I feel a bit fangirl doing this, but there was something, in fact, a number of things in your conversation that really drew me in. So thank you for that. I suppose I was drawn to the topic in the first place because the strapline of my coaching practice, the sounding board in Northern Ireland, is I listen so you can hear yourself think. And there were so many different levels of that listening that you got into that I have a much better understanding of how I'm trying and why I'm trying to put listening at the very center of my practice as a coach. The first thread that really grabbed me was a comment about people who have a second language listen with a perhaps different granularity. I studied French at university, lived in France for a couple of years. I was really immersed in a completely different language. And I'm really conscious that having a second language and learning a second language has stretched me both in terms of my own meaning making, but also in terms of appreciation of the kind of assumptions we bring to words, how those can get lost in translation. So holding my own assumptions about meaning of a word is something that I've learned to a certain extent through that formation. You had a lovely exchange around listening across cultures and across generations. And it's an aspect which I'm really looking forward to mulling on further because it chimed with some training I did in group and systemic mediation. Thank you for planting some new seeds in that field for me. But one thing that's emerging for me is something about the power of language rooted in place. And that came home to me recently in a chemistry call where I used a particular word from the Ulster Scots dialect that we have in Northern Ireland. And there was a real palpable connection in the person I was speaking with who perhaps felt seen or heard, more likely, a connection in that of a shared hinterland. So there's something interesting to start unpicking around that as well. One aspect that kind of got revealed a little more was how my experience as a musician has underpinned my listening in ways I hadn't appreciated. So I studied music at school and then played in a couple of bands, an indie thrash band and a Riot Girl band. And there is something about being in bands, apart from that active listening live to each other and the kind of communication that goes on in that space, but also the process of recording in a studio. So you end up listening over and over and over again to the same phrase of music, picking out the nuances, listening to what needs to be tweaked. So this has perhaps given me an ear tuned more acutely to the cadences and the rhythms of speech. And there was a lovely personal connection when, Oscar, you mentioned a reflection on Dame Evelyn Glennie, and I was transported back to being a young cellist in a pro-am workshop with the Ulster Orchestra, which she was leading. So it was a particular delight to reconnect with that memory. And it was lovely then to pick up on some of the threads of the thinking around the place of music in your subsequent podcast with Iris. I kind of wish that I'd listened to How to Listen before I submitted my accreditation application to the Association for Coaching, because now I feel much more able to articulate some of what I'm doing in the way that I make noises in the recordings that I listen back to of the coaching session. So how I'm shaping the environment in which my thinker is doing what they need to do. And there were a couple of phrases which now I have a better understanding around leaving the sound with the other person, and which is now a kind of an ellipsis, and I have a way of articulating what's going on in that space. So there's something about this episode, and in particular the silences between you, which it was lovely to just experience, but that's helped me to join dots from the past and the present and create new ones for the future, and where I could see glimmers of myself unexpectedly.
What I took away from the conversation between Oscar and Claire, one of the first thing that intrigued me was the annotation around the conversations and writing down what listening looks like. I've been thinking around listening audits. I'm working as part of an organization, and it's an opportunity for me sometimes to be a bit of a team coach. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm a team observer and sharer of feedback. And I think the way Oscar shared how he started doing the audits and using the little marks on how the exchange would unfold, that is something that I want to try to practice and maybe find some discrete signs of my own so that I can evidence the feedback a little bit more. Those listening audits and the idea of finding a way to code listening, that's also something that resonated for me. Parts of the people I work with are technical people. They might be reluctant to open up to listening skills and coaching and more generally interpersonal skills. I've used Oscar as the person who coded listening as my hook for them to get interested. So that's already something that I've put in practice, and it's worked. And people who thought they were terrible at listening and it was too human for them, realized that other people had looked at it in a very analytical way and found a way to then open up to that. Another reflection that came to me was around the use of silence and what silence may feel like, especially in Western cultures. And then there was this expression of the pregnant pause. And when Oscar mentioned it, felt like there was a negative connotation to it. And actually for me, it stood out as an expression that contained a lot of positivity. I have gone through 2 pregnancies, and I was lucky that they were good moments and that I have now got 2 beautiful children. And so for me, the silence of the pregnant pause is a creative silence. It's a generative, deep silence where there's actually a lot going on. And for a period of time, we don't even see it in the surface. And then maybe we'll start seeing a shape and we can't really guess what's coming. And then eventually something comes and it was all worth the wait. So a pregnant pause for me is something that I will listen to in a patient and positively curious way. And I think it can't be rushed, and I'm welcoming this time and letting people process and create internally what then they might decide to share. And finally, another reflection around silence and how it may feel like in different cultures. As I've met with more coaches, especially coaches in the UK, I've realized that a few of them got interested or joined Quakerism, which was something for me as a French background, it was something quite new that I discovered when I came to the UK. And the way silence is experienced and valued in this particular form of religion and for this type of spirituality, I think is very interesting. And I'm not surprised to find that a lot of coaches are drawn to this. And so in the insights that were shared around cultures in Australia, cultures around the world, Ubuntu was mentioned. For me, we shouldn't think that we're always the Westerners who are partly proud, partly sad to have this culture of industry and of action and loud and noise, because I think it's stopping at our prejudice and we should be more curious. And there might be places, times, school of thoughts where we can open up to realize that we can do this and it's not that foreign. It is human, so it's in all of us and it's been done before, and that might give us the patience and the courage and the wisdom to realize, yeah, it is doable, and also the kick that we need sometimes to just dig that little bit deeper and do it, because it is part of our human nature, not attached or detached from any culture in particular. So yes, there were a lot of thoughts that followed this fantastic dialogue, and revisiting it also now with my interest in storytelling, listening as an observer of Oscar's craftsmanship with storytelling and how he got all of us hooked into his initial story, how we could all relate to it. And he didn't jump to the end of the story. Obviously, he knew it, but he replayed it with us as if he didn't know how it would end, so that we could really be in each moment of his story. This is something that on the second listen really was a lot clearer for me, and maybe with my current interest in how people use storytelling, this is something that I found was very fabulous to listen to. And it's got me to reflect that through this great storytelling, through this great connection that was then made with him as a speaker, as part of the conversation with Claire, I was so much more receptive and so much more, it was so much easier to be part of the conversation as a quiet party to it, and maybe an asynchronous party to it, that could still get a lot of connection, a lot of great listening, because I had been prepared by this beautiful entry.
One thing that I know now, and that I did not know before listening to the latest podcast, is that listening is much more
and paying attention to the words being said. It is about co-creating the space so that deep listening can take place. To listen is to truly honor and respect the person in front of you so that new insights and perspectives can be created.
Hi Claire, my name is Joanne Appleton and I'm sending this video about the How to Listen podcast. In the original podcast about the value of culture and understanding culture within a conversation, and particularly how I facilitate within organisations, so being aware of the organisational history and culture. As I've reflected on that further, and as I've listened again to the podcast and reflected on that, I think I can build on that. Whenever you're facilitating or coaching a group, it's not just a one-way conversation between two people where the speaking and the listening sort of happens turn by turn. As a facilitator going in and working with a group of people, part of my role is to help people to feel heard and understood within that group setting. And so part of my role is to be listening to all the different voices who are speaking, and not just me and seeking to understand what they are actually saying, but also enabling other people to understand what that person is saying, creating a safe space where sometimes quite difficult conversations can happen, or sometimes, and this is where I get really excited, someone will say something and you'll unpack it a bit and someone else will go, oh, so by that you're meaning this. And what emerges can be quite beautiful, is a great word, can be quite beautiful. And it can really change the dynamic, change the relationship, or even change the course of something that's going to happen. A lot of my work is within GP practices, and it's working on access and how people access appointments. Actually getting the GP and the receptionist and the practice manager and someone in the back office who deals with all the paperwork together to listen to each other about what is really going on, and creating the space for those conversations. And if you're really brave, getting a patient involved as well, to listen to them, and creating that safe space for people to be able to listen to each other. That's great. I think what you talked about as well, about the difference with culture and language, and if you're working with multicultural teams, that's even more so, where you're just making sure that people are picking up what other people are saying. And just because a phrase is in a particular way, it's picked up differently. One-to-one coaching, just briefly, I have started on that coaching journey last year. Silence and holding silence and not interrupting is huge for me. I'm from Northern Ireland, and you've talked about the musicality of conversation and how people talk. I think if you recorded the sound of a conversation of people from Northern Ireland, particularly where there's banter and crack and, it's energised, compared to English conversation, there'd be a lot more interrupting, a lot more talking over each other. And so for me, having lived as an exile in England for the last 30 years by choice, it is a challenge not to interrupt, not to talk over people. I find that particularly in meetings. In coaching, I'm much more conscious of it, and so consciously try to hold that silence and hold it a little bit longer and not interrupt. And I'm very aware of when I do interrupt, and I try very hard not to, and try to always do better if I do. I'm always disappointed with myself because it's, well, what's emerged if... What's that insight that's been lost because I interrupted that I'm not going to get back? But also I'm thinking about that then, how do I use silence as a tool within those bigger group settings and make sure that I'm holding silence, not just jumping in the next thing, not just trying to move on the group, but letting that extra bit. And also for people who aren't used to that, making sure that they are warned about that. So the work that I'm going to be doing going forward, I think I'm going to incorporate that within my scene setting. Is there might be times whenever the conversation stops and I don't say anything either. Let's see what emerges. Let's see what comes out of that. So thank you for all that you're doing with the Coaching In. I love the podcast and I find it incredibly informative and inspiring for my practice as well. So thank you.
Hi, this is Josephine. My reflections on the interview with Oscar and Claire. Awareness that it's about being listening and not doing listening. It sounds so simple, yet I realised I think I was doing a method or thinking about a method and was still very much in my head thinking about that method rather than being in the flow of the conversation. And it's dropped from my head down into my being. And this episode particularly helped me realise that in the moment and to relax. And it feels that it's just a lot simpler now.
Hi Claire, hi Oscar. I'm here with the book. You can see all the post-its on the useful insights and chapters. Fantastic book. I think what it's done for me is helped me to worry much less about the performance in coaching and focus on those pivotal moments in a session. It's typically a look, a gesture. I think it highlights how, if you really listen hard, you see that moment when someone finds their meaning. And as Oscar points out, there are certain trigger words for that. Actually, now I think about it, also. So listening out for those moments, looking for those moments. And then instead of making the meaning for the person, which is always the temptation, giving them the space to make the meaning themselves and generate the insight. I think the other thing that this book has done for me is a really useful pre-coaching ritual. So just breathing for 4 seconds in, holding it, breathing out for 4. The routine is in the book. It helps you go into a session grounded, feet firmly on the floor and ready to be in service. So thank you very much. Can't wait to be part of what Oscar does next.
Hi, Oscar and Claire. My name is Risen. I'm an individual and team coach and focusing on leadership transition and the stuff that gets in the way. I also do facilitation, support all areas, including culture change. I'm here to provide some insight from what I got from listening to podcasts. I've also read Oscar's book and I've taken a while to really reflect on what that might be. The first thing is around connection. You can really feel the connection from a heartfelt perspective. And I've never really felt that before through all the time in coaching and other things. So I think that's really profound. And I think for those who are really starting out, or anybody who's coached even for years, I think just listening, understanding that is really profound. The other thing is around perspective. And I picked up what Oscar said around change and the fact that the changes might give many have perspective in change, but also it's our perspective as well. And I really tried to take that on board. The other thing is being seen, heard and valued. And it's that last piece that's really struck with me. I often hear Claire saying, good coaching is about how people feel heard and making a little bit of progress. But I think it's that value piece as well. People really want to feel that valued. So yeah, I'm really kind of touched by that. The kind of the final piece, which really struck me right at the end of the podcast, was around what Oscar said. By being present, you changed me. Oh my God, that pulls up heartstrings. And I just, as coaches, or perhaps it's just me, you really forget some of these really human things. And it's actually bring a human behind the coach, funny enough, Claire. And ensuring that it's the human things. It's the things that are seen heard and felt are the fundamental to what makes our listening the best it can be. And I've really noticed that even in the period since May when the initial podcast went out. So I really want to thank you for that. I think one of the things, Claire, you shared on the supervision recently was what came away from that conversation and Kathryn Mannix's conversation was around the fact you felt like you were best friends. Obviously you weren't. But I think that's really key in that kind of sense of trust and through really present listening. Amazing. And I still go back to it and I'm still looking over it. Just in a little way so I can listen a little better to my children in particular, who are my most valuable people in my world. Thank you for taking the time for recording the podcast, and I very much look forward to the next one.
What outstanding podcast. The light bulb moment for me was to recognize the importance of language in listening and how that influences the transformation in a coaching conversation. I have just to myself as to why some of my previous coaching conversations may not have been as expected. Language and listening with the body. Just amazing. Thank you very much.
Hi, Oscar. Hi, Claire. My thoughts on your wonderful podcast on listening. So my initial response was really to say, I was struck hugely by this idea that I am in fact multilingual when I can only speak one language. But the languages that I can use to communicate in conversation are around things like mathematics, engineering and sport. And they are great spaces to understand the world and communicate with the world and often connect with people in quite different ways. And that is amazing. So thank you both for kind of helping me to understand that, get my head around it. You also asked me, well, what else has been going on since that conversation happened? Well, I've had a conversation with Oscar as well, which has been really thought-provoking. And what I wanted to explore with him was, well, what does that mean? And where does that go? And what has struck me is the importance around the preparation for conversation and the importance around creating the rules of engagement, or I guess the deciding how we're going to do conversation so that it serves our purposes and we all know what we're doing and why we're doing it. Because if we can do that well, we can have far better and more powerful conversations. I was also struck by that thing about listening with real intention that Oscar touched on, that kind of listening mapping of understanding who is speaking, how often are they speaking, what are the types of questions that are being asked, are they questions that actually support us to understand more deeply what on earth it is we want to communicate or not. And all this stuff really feels like it's supporting my own journey on being a better listener. And I've really enjoyed starting to think about this more. So that's where I got to. I suspect more will come, but that's the nature of the beast, isn't it, when we're thinking about iterative work. So hopefully that gives you something to move forwards with. Take care.
Hello, this is Naomi with some reflections about the podcast. And firstly, in relationship to making agreements, the idea of ground rules. And there's a poem I came across a while ago called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings by the former poet laureate Joy Harjo, who is a member of the Muskogee Creek Nations. It's set conflict resolution ground rules. Recognize whose lands these are on which we stand. Ask the deer, turtle, and the crane. Make sure the spirits of these lands are respected and treated with goodwill. The land is a being who remembers everything. This
reframed this idea of ground rules that we can skim over at the beginning of a piece of work. And here is some responsibility to the land, the past, the history, and the ecologies that we are but a small part of. Another reflection I had from the podcast was about how knowing another language is a context for listening differently. Working with lots of international people learning coaching, it's pretty important to be curious about this. And I had a chat with a friend yesterday, actually, who is Greek, and she's now fluent in English, but she was sharing that it feels very different, that context. So Greek for her is embodied. So if she needs to think about something that needs that weight of knowing or remembering, she'll think in Greek. And if it's something that's more surface, she will think in English. And if it's something that happened in England, she might think in English. So much to learn about this. It'd be great to have a bigger conversation about it on the podcast.
The first time that I listened to a podcast, what I came away with was that listening is so much deeper than the elements of speech, and that silence requires quality and reverence. The other thing that I came away with, that I needed to implement something in my pre-sessions, which I've since done. And that is having to do with what an individual might need when they're getting ready to have a coaching session. So I wrote in my email, my pre-session email, what might you need to do to prepare for the coaching session. And this might be something that either you need to do on your own prior to the session or together that we do in a coaching space. Having listened to the podcast a second time, some additional insights that came to light. It was rather interesting that listen and silent are an anagram, which I thought was kind of cool. And I had read a recent article called Presence, Listening, Awareness, and Growth, that was written by Susan Britton and Jessica Burdick. And this led me to reading another article. It's called Silence and Its Effects on the Autonomic Nervous System, a Systematic Review. And in reading this, I hadn't really thought about it too deeply about silence, is that they had listed 6 different types of silence. There was outer silence, inner silence, social silence, emotional silence, ritualistic silence, and reflective silence. And that had me thinking about silence as being something that can be in service to self and in service to others. So I was thinking then, can silence then be the gift of giving, and listening can be a gift of receiving? And the other element, though, listening, is that it requires depth. As Claire had mentioned, the hearing, the seeing, the sensing, and it also requires the breath. Like Oscar had said, the past, the present, and the future. So he was reflecting on, can listening then be an act of a coactive, in that people are acting together? Co-creation, where they're creating something together. Co-regulation, which came through reading that earlier article. It indicated that there's a psychological state of one individual can influence that of another. And lastly, about co-inquiry, that being a collaborative way to clarify ideas and experiences and sharing those ideas and understandings. So that's what I came away with from listening to the podcast. So thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of the follow-up podcast that you do with Oscar Trimboli on how to listen. The insight that I shared in an email after listening to the podcast the first time was that my biggest takeaway was this idea of listening with one's whole body, and how that had sparked in me a memory of an interaction. I had initiated the conversation with my coaching supervisor, telling her a little anecdote about something that had happened earlier that week that had made me feel warm and fuzzy. And the anecdote was that my 16-year-old daughter had come home from school and told me all sorts of things that were going on in her head about her thoughts and plans and hopes for the future beyond school. And I had said to my supervisor, it's so unusual for her to share so much with me. And my supervisor asked me what it turns out was an ingenious question. She said, what was different about you that day? And my initial thought was, well, it's not me that was different. I'm always there when my daughter comes home from school, or almost always. And I always ask her how her day was. So it must have been her that was different. But she sat in silence while I thought about that a bit more, and I had to think back to the moment and think what was really going on. And I realised that usually when my daughter comes home from school, I will be in my office. And although my door will be open, and I probably will, if I'm not on a call, will stand up and walk to the kitchen with her and ask her how her day was, probably my body language tells her that I'm still in work mode. And I think that day I was already in the kitchen when she came home. I think I had my laptop with me, but I think I closed it as she walked into the room. And then the biggest insight that I had was that I think perhaps I didn't initiate the conversation with a question. I think I didn't ask her anything with words, that perhaps I just looked at her in a way that said, tell me. And so she did. That was the insight I shared the first time. The insights I've had, or additional reminders of the things that I really enjoyed about the conversation that the two of you had the first time, because there's so much in there. One of them was about the people speaking their native languages, and Oscar's observation that perhaps people who speak more than one native language listen with greater granularity than those who only have one. And then Claire's building on that of saying that, yeah, we don't need to be able to understand necessarily what people are saying, and the two of them then recognising that it's about how you witness how things are said, not what's said. And it's encouraged me once again to offer to the clients I have that speak French or Spanish as a native language, to offer for them to speak their native language when we're working together. Because although their English is usually better than my French or Spanish, I do speak those languages well enough to understand everything they say, or almost everything they say, and knowing that I don't need to follow the whole story, and knowing that they would likely think differently in their native language is encouraging me to offer that, hopefully in a way that doesn't make them feel that I don't believe their English is good enough. So I think I need to find a way of doing that. And the other thing that really sparked my interest is about the different ways in which different cultures, particularly collectivist cultures or indigenous peoples, listen to the lands and themselves and each other in a very different way. And it's building on an episode of More or Less that I listened to last week about how many languages we're losing on a regular basis, and I feel that seems such a travesty, because different languages all have such a different richness to give us in terms of worldview, philosophy, ways of being. And so that part sparked my interest too. Thank you very much.
What I'm learning about listening since the last podcast is that exploring listening with a presence in a way that I'm not anxious about what to do or say in the thinker finishes, but basically expect that whatever needs to show up will show up after the thinker has spoken and I have listened. And to me, this requires kind of a courage that I don't have to prepare. I'm also thinking about how can I listen with my whole body, what is happening for me as I hear the thinker speaking, and how to share it with the thinker. And, I'm becoming a bit more aware that probably the act of listening intently can change the person's thinking.
without me having to do anything specifically. I don't know, but that's just what I am thinking. And maybe, given Nike's quote, just do it, I think we need to have more of just listen as a tagline. In today's world where the deep listening is so rare. Thank you.
Listening to the Oscar Trimboli episode about listening and silence, I just wanted to say that I was transported to loggerheads, 3 o'clock in the morning, like the time when I went for listening to Dawn Chorus. And it reminded me of the silence of that waiting for the first blackbird to sing. And silence then appeared to me like a space with complete width, but a darkness where something will come in to decorate it. And as a poet and a coach, I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about silence in different guises, and this brought it all together in one thing. That when silence for me is that width and depth, and something comes forward into it to light it up, that was the image that was in my head, and there's something there for me to explore. So I'm just saying thank you for the episode and the thinking time.
I wanted to share my insight following listening to the podcast. I've grown up with parents speaking a mixture of many different languages, including English, Hindi, Punjabi, Swahili, Gujarati, and a few others. And even though I can only speak English, it is not uncommon for my parents, and particularly my mum, to switch language in a conversation. I notice it's mainly when she needs to express a feeling, and English just doesn't do that feeling justice. And this is quite normal for me. I'm also aware how odd this might sound if someone was listening in. It was after listening to this podcast and hearing Oscar talk about this that firstly made me really grateful for my upbringing. And secondly, it helped me understand how I can get what people from other cultures are trying to say when English words fail them. I work in a business where I do come across many people from different cultures. What I've reflected on is that I'm able to pick up signals beyond the words, such as tone, expression, body movement, and I'm able to connect with the essence of what that other person might be trying to say. The actual words doesn't really matter. In these situations, notice that I don't make assumptions, unlike perhaps when I am communicating with someone else in English and there are plenty of assumptions being made. I'm just reflecting that my listening or levels of listening are different when speaking and listening to other people who speak other languages. This has been a really nice insight for myself, and I'll definitely be reading Oscar's book and listening to others on this topic. It was a really, really great listen, and I'm actually now going to go and re-listen to the podcast.
Initially, what I took from the conversation on the podcast was linking the importance of past, present, and future, the acknowledgement of what came before, to how important it is to pay attention to how we begin and how we end, whether that's in individual sessions, training programs, change programs. If we don't pay attention to the beginning, how can we end well? And vice versa. If we don't end well, how can we begin something else well? And that was my sense making. And then, of course, I listened again. And whilst I could still make sense in the same way, I realised that the shape of my listening changed the second time around. Who I am being, to use Oscar's phrase, who I'm being listening is different depending on when I'm listening and what else has happened during that particular time, the context being so important because it shifted and changed again. That shape of listening keeps changing.
Honestly, when I heard that, I cried. because I'm so moved by the experience of this kind of co-learning space and hearing what you're building and what we're all building together out of simply a conversation. It's absolutely extraordinary. If you didn't listen to the first episode and respond, and you want to respond now, share your reflection by emailing info@3dcoaching.com with the subject listen, and we'd absolutely love to hear from you. So here comes the new recording. So we invited Shaney into the recording because it was Shaney Crawford who first introduced me and Oscar, or Oscar and I. And I got an email from Oscar when I came back from holiday saying, let's experiment. Let's have another conversation and see what happens. So here it is, and let's see what happens.
You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
I have no idea how we're going to do this.
My style is see how we get on, just kick off and see how we go. I thought the data was fascinating. I think what's more fascinating about the data is the episodes that people keep talking about and the episodes that they forget. I shared it with these people on this Deepening Partnership course and another one by Kathryn Mannix, how much they were more interested in how we talked than what we talked about. I thought that was fascinating.
I think the process bit gets people super curious, the how versus the what. Well, as we hear Claire say that, what's going through your mind?
I listened to the podcast as a podcast, and then I watched it as a video, and that was very interesting. And I feel like the two of you are like Jedi masters in listening. And so it was like a Jedi face-off, like who's going to talk first? because that's the sort of amazing thing about the way that you both listen, is that you create so much space for the other person. So the two of you creating so much space for each other was, for me, fascinating to watch and to listen to. But more to watch. I didn't catch it as much listening as I did. There's bigger pauses, but watching as well, there was a lot to see there too.
And having done the same thing, meaning listen to it and then watch it. I mean, I was there live, but watching the recording on YouTube, there's nothing that Claire disguises in her face. You can see it signaling things, whether that's go and be curious about that or that's had a big impact. There's no secrets with Claire's face.
I listened to it on the train on Friday, and I was really proud of how much space we left after each. There was the pauses. I just thought the pauses were really interesting.
What else surprised you about the audience reaction, Claire?
I know we asked them to respond, but people kept on responding. And when I'm in supervision groups, people talk about it. It's the thing that keeps on giving. It's the episode that keeps on giving. And I think partly that is that they met both of us. Yeah, and I think there isn't that much around. There are books to read on listening, but listening to something about listening is a different thing. Or as you say, Shani, watching?
I was just saying to Shani earlier on, Claire, that I threw the episode into an AI tool and asked for to pull out the highlights, and it pulled out 5 highlights. 2 of them was, being listening versus doing listening. And the other one was second language, whatever that means, when we were talking about second language. So I think the other 3 that the AI picked out was co-creation, flexibility, and the actual origin story, so the backstory in the conversation. Yet when I read the feedback from the audience, the one thing that's consistent in the feedback from the audience is the beyond be listening and second language was acknowledging the past. And it got me thinking, like, AI will listen in a particular way, and this audience will listen in a particular way. And when we looked at the data that we had, so we had folks emailing us as well as sending us videos, this group was listening at a much different level from other groups that will typically be at level 1 and level 2. The feedback and the language and the syntax that people were using was more about context, backstory, noticing the state of the speaker, which is kind of level 2. But there was a maturity in this group that isn't present in generic audiences.
And they're more likely to be interested in, as you said, Oscar, how we listen. So the looking. So I just caught myself as you were talking, entirely taking my timing from what I saw, and not from what, as well as from what I heard, but from what I saw. And I think that that's underplayed in lots of spaces about listening, that the looking, whether that's a visual looking or a on the phone and you can't see them looking, but a deeper looking, I think, is missing often. I had a hysterical thing last week. I was doing a train the trainer in an organisation for coaches. And I said, we'll have a coaching conversation. I'll do it with somebody, and then we'll talk about how we give feedback to people. So I said to her, what do you want to think about? And she picked up her pen and she went, this. And then probably for the next 5 minutes, she wasn't looking at me. So I wasn't saying anything because she was busy. And in the feedback, one of them said, I hated the silence. At which point, this lady had a real opinion. The lady who'd been using the silence well had a very strong opinion. But the thing that was really interesting was at the end of the conversation, and if you're on audio, I'm just waving my pencil in the air. She's holding her pencil in her hand and waving it about. And I said, what does your pencil need to say? And off she went. And somebody said, why did you say that? And I thought that was really interesting because I saw her pencil going, I've still got something to say. But clearly that's a formed insight or a natural instinct. I don't know. It's very interesting.
And I think it comes back to the point that was made by multiple listeners who came back and talked about how we were role modeling rather than teaching, and that it was more impactful for them to see how, be how, and I think it was Julian that said something like, I realised I needed to perform and just be present. And to me, that was profound, because it's not a way I would explain it. So this is the lovely thing about having the ability to be reflective and reflexive about what the audience said, which is not an opportunity we often get. And I'm curious, Claire, when I sent out this email saying, would you like to experiment?
I'm going to say something else first, if I may. As you were talking then, I recognised that I wasn't, that I was only listening, that I wasn't thinking about anything else, and I was certainly not thinking about what I was going to say. Well, I was obviously thinking something because I was thinking that, but I wasn't thinking anything else. So that was interesting. So what was my response? My response now is, what an exciting thing to do another step in the experiment. My response then was, I so love that conversation. Of course we could have another one.
There's a document where we've collected all the feedback in. I'm just curious, as you kind of read through all of that, what are the big themes that are coming across for each of you?
I live in Japan, and I'm bilingual, Japanese and English. And so the theme of the second language really came out for me, and that's a topic that I'm just fascinated with, and always interested in having conversations about, because I know that I learned French in school because I'm Canadian. We have to learn French in school up until a certain grade. But I did it because I loved languages and I loved learning French. But the way that I learned French was from a textbook. And I didn't have a lot of exposure. This was before the internet, so I didn't have a lot of exposure to French TV shows or music or things like that. Whereas in Japan, I was plopped into the middle of a town of 13,000 people, and I was the only person who spoke English. And so it's very, very different learning learning a language in these two different ways. And what I found was that Japanese very quickly crowded out French in my brain. It took over. And to the point that I couldn't even have a basic conversation with someone in French after having studied it for more than 10 years to the university level. And so I'm just fascinated with how languages work, how language, how it's in the brain, how, like, that is just fascinating, because how can that happen? How can one language crowd out another? What's going on there? And so the connections between listening, coaching, languages, and speaking, of course, and my background is in linguistics. My undergraduate degree is in linguistics. So I just love this topic. So that's the one that jumped out at me the most.
And build on what Shani said. So I also learnt French for more than 10 years. And at the peak of my French people thought I was Belgian, which I thought was great feedback. You know, if they think you're not English, that's a really great thing. And then 2 years ago, when I walked the Camino, I heard Spanish. I heard the sound of Spanish. And this year we spent a month in Spain, and I've been learning Spanish for 2 years. And people would say, your tone, your pace is, you sound like a Spanish person. I don't have very many words, but there's something about the way, it goes back to the how we communicate, doesn't it? And what was really interesting is we then went through France for 5 days coming home in our van, where I'd been comfortable and fluent and able to communicate, and I had no vocabulary. It'd gone. But the sound was still there. And so in dialogue, in listening and having conversations with people, there was a fluency in the way of having conversations, even though some of the word bits were missing. And a lady in a restaurant said to me, she said, "You sound French. So we can have a conversation that we understand because you sound..." Well, that's fascinating. So going back to your question, Oscar. Number one, I just loved the fact that people responded to the invitation, and there was a generosity in your offer in that dialogue that we had that went, "We've got some books for you, we'd love to hear what you've got to say." And it felt to me as though there was a responding to your generosity in the way that people responded back to us. And what I really loved, and I knew most but not all of the listeners I know personally, but some of them I don't. It felt like they were thinking. It felt in their responses, it actually felt like they were processing. And that was so exciting. Because it wasn't, the answer to the quiz question is A. You said "and" 460 times in this podcast. It was just, there was just a, that goes back to the how again, doesn't it? The way they've constructed their responses was just the most beautiful thing. What about you?
For me, it was delightful to see the video of somebody's written response, because I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you about French and Spanish is you touched on it. I didn't talk about it much, but you talked about the musicality of language, and you were working with a composer and a whole bunch of things we kind of picked up on at the end of that interview. And as I was listening to both of you, going, I wonder what the musicality of French versus Japanese, and I wonder what the musicality of French versus Spanish is. Like, as a complete novice, I think the tempos would be different. I don't know how different, but they would be different. And I'm just not sure how to express it. So just a quick one, Claire, for you and for Shani. How would you describe the musicality of those two contrasting languages?
I don't think it matters as long as you're in the same space as the person that you're talking to. So we run an online improvisation course now to support people to improve their presence. And our improv teacher, Andy, gave us this exercise, the last course, where we had to speak in gibberish. So we had to just go, and what he did was he had two people having a conversation like that. And then somebody else had to watch, and they had to decide what the conversation was about. And it was all fun. But what was really interesting was how actually you could do that. You could get a sense of what the conversation was about simply by the blah, 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 blah. And also you respond, the way you respond to somebody when that's the only, you can see and then you can hear the sound, but there's no meaning in it. But the way that you respond to somebody when you kind of dance it together creates its own meaning, which didn't answer your question at all, but I think it's really interesting.
Gave me a little insight there about, if we use gibberish as a proxy there, meaning happens when it's heard rather than meaning happens in its expression. Now, for those of you who aren't watching, there's a big light bulb that's going on over Claire's head right now.
Go back to the light bulb. I love that.
I have a sense that meaning only exists in a shared space. And the way I often visualize it is a clothes washing machine. When the lid is down and it's agitated and it's sudsy and it's dirty and it's moving, it's doing a lot of work, but nothing actually happens till the rinse cycle. And it's a completely different movement. And for me, when people are talking to themselves, their mind is like a washing machine. They're using up all this energy and intensity, and it's dirty and it's sudsy and they're agitated. And the rinse cycle is when they speak and share that. And at that point, a meaning emerges. Yet it has to exist in a shared space. You can make all the meaning of a story you want, but once you express it, it takes on a completely different meaning because you've been brave enough to share it. You've given it a presence in the world outside of your mind. And I think this is the privilege of when you are present to listen. And you are present and you be listening rather than do listening, that person feels that you've created the container in which it's safe enough to express something that's dirty, it's agitated them, it's sudsy, it's murky, it's not clear. And back to your specific question, no, I did not. Like that emerged now in this shared space. And it emerged because of your response to how I said it. Or because we're curious about the musicality of language. So Shani is watching.
I am. I'm thinking. It's so many things.
I'm just curious about what you notice in the way we're dialoguing.
I feel, well, possibly because you know each other a little bit more now and maybe you trust each other a little bit more now, you're volleying things back and forth and both of you are using your superpowers to build and then build and then build. Possibly more than in the first one, but I'd have to go back and listen to that one again to see if that. I think that was happening in the first one, but I feel like this exchange that you've just had right here has been quite remarkable, and it has made me go off thinking several times as well. Thinking I'm an addict. I'm a food addict, and I've lost about 100 pounds through being in a program for food addiction. And part of that is having a sponsor. And part of that is then becoming a sponsor once you've been in the program long enough. I can't remember where I was going with this. Yes, I do. As a sponsor, I need to listen to the other person speak to me for 15 minutes. And I also speak to somebody for 15 minutes. And I've noticed in myself and in my sponsees that this happens all the time, where there's a great jumble of messy clothes up in somebody's head and they're kind of pulling one out and, they're moving them around and jumbling them up, but nothing is happening. Action can't happen. Because it's too much of a jumble. And then once they start talking, and if I listen instead of try to interrupt or give advice or direct the conversation in any way, then they can pull out one piece of clothing at a time and decide what to do with it rather than it all just being jumbled up in there. And so that's the image that I was having in my head of this, of this line that comes out, and maybe you need to put some back and, take it out again, but just, it's the taking out, it's the speaking, it's the getting it out of you that does make the meaning, I think. Helps you know what you really actually think. And gets you towards action.
So I'm going to invite the three of us into a space called Time Out, Process Check. How are we going? We're about halfway through. Given the balance of our time together, how would we like to shape it?
I'm loving it.
I'm going to go first because I'm in this host role, and I don't think it's serving the audience if I stay there the whole time.
I love that we co-created something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oscar, do you do coaching as well as everything that you do in the listening forum? Because I know that Claire does listening, and that's a part of her coaching. So
Yes, that's probably the opposite. I'll pick clients who say to me, hey, do you coach? If I want to work with them, I'll say yes. If I don't, I'll refer them to somebody else. I get to pick too.
I think that's amazing.
That's fair.
And the reason I do that is a monk told me once. We were chatting about, I was starting off in business, blah, 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 blah. And I said to them, I just seem to want more. And they said, when is it enough? What's the difference between more and enough? And that was the perfect invitation at that time, because I reckon I was probably about, 90 days off burnout, because I was just saying yes to everybody, right? Oh, yes, and eventually I'm going to run out of money, so I better save up. So I'll say yes to that and say yes to that, and I'll just make the calendar work. And I'm sure the likelihood of me meeting and hearing that monk and having a one-on-one conversation with them at that time was no coincidence, right? And that simple statement stayed with me forever. What's the difference between, for you, what's the difference between more and enough? And then once my dad got sick, more and enough was a completely different formula for me. A lot of people say, oh, I want to work a 4-day week. And I was like, I will be careful what you wish for. I have to work a 3.5-day week. And they kind of look at me crazy. It's like, the other time is care time for my father. And they go, oh, okay. And all of a sudden, their perception of a 3.5-day week is very different. So back to your question. Yes, I coach by choice. But my preference is to coach listening, speak listening, author listening, publish listening. That's kind of the inverse, I suspect, of Claire's approach. Although for both of us, it's very integrated.
I just had an insight as you were talking about how to move the boundary of what's life-giving. So thank you for that. It was insight about what to say no to, actually.
It's a fairly simple binary to carry around with you. More versus enough, because I speculate, Shani, same is true for food.
So I never was able to have enough food, and enough, and if I don't, since I've put down food and got that regulated, then something else comes up. I need to go shopping, or I need to be on my phone, or, it's this. I think this is something that all humans, well, I don't know about all humans, but all humans who have tendencies to be addicts don't know what's enough, can't get enough. Until that hole gets filled. There's a hole inside you that gets filled at some point, hopefully. And I think that's the thing that, like, once you feel like you're enough, then everything else can be enough.
Beautiful. Well said. So we've got a hole to fill for 45 minutes or not. We don't have to go for 45 minutes. Like, we could stop right now. What would they want us to chat about in our remaining time?
I know one question they would. Do you want me to host this bit now? I'm really curious about what do each of us know now that we, or feel now or understand now that we didn't have at the beginning of this conversation.
And before I answer, I want everyone to notice that Claire's tempo, word choices were completely different to previous conversations we had the minute she moved into host mode. So I'm just curious if you've all heard that in her voice.
Nice process thing, Oscar.
What do we know now that we didn't know before? So coming into today's conversation, I was thinking, I need to have the notes in front of me, and I need to have the pen and the paper and the and I need to prepare, and I was nervous. But I also know that both of you say you need to be present, you need to listen, and you need to listen and build rather than listen to respond.
Oh.
And so through this conversation, I've been trying to quieten my own insecurities and also my own voice inside my head saying, oh, tell them the story about, and then this happened and then that happened, and oh, it wouldn't, just quieten that down and just actually listen and trust that there will be something to say when it gets to you. And that's been a really good, it's a kind of crazy time to test this out. Very public way to test it out. I've been trying to do that, and I've been learning, therefore, to trust myself a little bit more and to trust the process, trust the listening process.
Loving your honesty. How does that feel, Shani, to have trusted the process in front of others?
It was scary. It's scary because I'm used to, we're all used to the way that we normally listen and the way that we normally communicate, which is person says ABC and the other person says, oh yeah, I also ABC, but doesn't actually connect with like, yeah, but I'm saying this is my ABC, not your ABC. And so, yes, it's hard, but it's so important. And I think I think that this is the safe place to do that, even though it's in front of however many, I don't know how many people will see this in the future, but this is what the two of you, I think the two of you are all about, is being present and making that space for other people to think and for yourself to think.
And just to build on the ABC yours and the ABC theirs, this is where people are listening at level 2 at the content. That's like your ABC and my ABC. And when you move up to 3, it's a shared context. What is shared in A? What is shared in B? What is shared in C? Rather than your ABC is different to my ABC, or maybe we can do a bit of deconstruction and see what's shared in the A, the B, and the C, or we can see what's shared across all of those. And I think one of the things that people often ask me is like, how can you listen to the dialogue rather than the participants? And too many of us get stuck in listening to the participants rather than is the dialogue progressing based on the original intent of what the participants have arrived at. So the insight is when you hear the ABC and my ABC and your ABC, you're in a place where you are still telling yourself a story as the listener, why their ABC is wrong or incorrect or whatever value judgment. But if you can find shared elements in that, you may find also a way to progress. So thanks for sharing that one. I want to come back to Claire's question, though. In the East, and Shani, you can talk to this, but I've had it shown to me more explicitly in Chinese art. It may be present in Japanese art, but I don't know well enough. There is a very famous diagram painting, and Shani, you'll know the one I'm referring to. It's a fisherman on a very small boat with huge waves, and it's a iconic
Hokusai.
Hokusai, thank you. And what it is about is using negative space versus positive space. So how can you highlight something very small by making everything around it very large? And just a insight into the way my brain works, when Claire says, what do we know now that we didn't before? I always move into this mindset is what's the opposite of that and why haven't they asked that? So Claire asked, what do we know that we didn't know before? And my mind went to, I wonder what we don't know. And I play with this duality and go, I wonder if it's helpful for the shared meaning, the group, the dialogue to bring that up or not. And that's why in communication, our choice of words shapes the container we're going to dialogue through. So Claire's asked, made the invitation, what do we know that we didn't know before? So for me, what I know now is that meaning can only exist when it's shared is ironic because I had to share it to understand its value, right? Same way it's ironic that the way I discovered somebody pointing out I'm a good listener, from the minute they said that, I stopped listening in the original meeting. So what it's got me speculating on right now is I wonder if my mind is open enough to understand what I don't know because of this amazing interaction right now. And is that just a simple example of more versus enough? Is enough just being happy with what I know? And is more the relentless pursuit of what I don't still know? So that's what I'm juggling with right now. And Claire's got a wonderful smile on her face.
I've noticed two things, and I don't have a clue. I'm just going to offer the words. There's something about soul. There's something about a willingness to have some level of soul connection. And there's also something about slowing right down. Yeah.
What I'm sensing right now is that a meeting that's scheduled for 45 minutes or an hour or 90 minutes or whatever, often the counterpart, the person you're working with, can have their breakthrough in 15 minutes. So stop. and check, is that enough for them in this conversation? Because the remaining time, you may overwhelm them. And they need to process that fully, whether that's embodying it in action or anything else. But that can only exist if you're present to everything that's happening around them. And I think, to Claire and Shani, thank you, because the other thing I said to you at the beginning, I have no idea where this is going. Part of my brain's going, how do I construct this into a valuable artifact for everybody, and sharing all the amazing recordings and trusting myself enough to do that. There's an openness I can feel of a kind of opera singer. I feel my diaphragm's fuller, and yet my head is emptier, if that makes sense.
I love that. And you can see it, can't you, Shani? You can see it in his face. Shani, anything you want to build on there?
My past pattern of listening has been mainly speaking. before I met Oscar and before I met you, Claire, and listened to all of your podcasts and read your books, I realized that my main way of communicating was speaking over people instead of listening to them. And so this has been a very, very incredible opportunity for me just to listen and not try to construct, not try to think at the same, actively try not to think at the same time as listening. Because you can't do them both at the same time properly.
Ah. What a beautiful line.
And this is where people say to me that listening is hard. You know, listening is difficult, it's draining. And to me, if you're just present, the listening will happen as the byproduct. You don't have to try to listen. If you're present first, you've got the foundation there. So I visualize a really bad analogy here, but I visualize a sumo before they move into the wrestle. They put 1 foot down and 1 foot down, and they've got their presence. That is very practiced, and everything after that is built on top of that. But if you haven't got that solid foundation, you can't help them expand and move the dialogue forward. So for a lot of us, when we find listening is hard, it's just a signal to you that you're not present. It's not a signal that you're a bad listener.
Ah.
Be in your body and feel what is not present for you first. Because a lot of people think it's all about how do I listen to, it's like, what are you not listening to in yourself? And then once you've got that foundation, building on the rest is much easier.
Can I build on that? As you were talking, I was thinking about judo, actually. I know more about judo than karate, although I don't know a lot about judo. But the idea in judo that it's not that you get yourself on solid feet and then try to pull the other person or push the other person, but that, like, the first character in judo is yawarakai, which means soft and flexible, because you need to use that flexibility, or you need to be flexible and sense what the other person is going to do or say, or not say in judo, but what they're going to do. Use that against them to pull them down. But just this interplay between the two people has to be built on flexibility rather than this idea of like, I'm listening now. It shouldn't be that hard.
And again, with judo or karate, it's all happens in a shared space. You can practice all you want by yourself, but the minute the two come into contact, whatever you thought, you have to. And when people say to me, well, what does the research say about great listeners? They're flexible and they're curious. They're the two things in my research that separates people who can dialogue and explain at level 3, 4, and 5 versus those at 1 and 2 is flexibility and curiosity. They don't hold a position. They're flexible, and they're flexible because they're curious. So those two work together.
Softer listening, not harder listening. I'm just wondering whether that's enough.
So as we have a process check in the middle, let's do a debrief at the end.
You start.
I'm going to throw it right out there and say this episode is more powerful than the first one.
I agree.
I agree.
And we say listening, situational, relational, contextual. We think about all those three things because we're doing this for, we shared a space through the documents and all of that, but the trust, like, I've taken risks here I don't take anywhere else.
Oh. I think I agree with you. I think there was something about an agreement here to co-create, which felt like it was an agreement to go where no one's, where we haven't gone before. And what a beautiful thing that is.
I want more. Make it happen again, please. I'll accept enough for today. As long as you can talk again, because I really think this is world-class learning, deep thinking and learning that's happening here. And I hope it can happen again.
The other day, I was trying to explain to somebody what this experiment was about. And they said to me, so you were trying to share everything that you know about listening? And I said, no, we weren't trying to share what we already know about listening. We were trying to learn, as Oscar said, about what we didn't know about listening. I have to say that this episode was extraordinary. It was most wonderful and also most edgy. There was a lot of emotion around it, and so much learning about what in coaching we call the space between. But the space between is a very intangible thing, and I think the thing that I absolutely love listening to back to that episode is to recognise that you can hear the space between, and you can sense what it feels like, and what a beautiful thing that is. There's another episode, series 3, episode 6, on listening with Kathryn Mannix, where there's a similar experience, I think, of how somebody is having a conversation. If you want to learn how to do this more, we've got a number of courses about deeper stuff. So we're running a deeper noticing program with somebody who takes photographs using mindful photography. And we're not teaching people to be mindful photographers, but we're teaching us to look and to look again and to see. And I think that's one of the things that coaches are weaker at is listening through seeing. It's so interesting. And we've also got a deeper partnership course. And this is going to be part of the pre-work for that. Certainly the first episode with Oscar was, and this will be as well, because it's about what does deeper partnerships really sound like, as in the music. What does it look like? And I'll put details of those in the show notes. If you didn't listen to the first episode when it was originally broadcast, we'd love you to share your reflections by emailing info@3dcoaching.com using the subject listen in the subject line. And there are some more books to give away. There are 10 more copies of Oscar's How to Listen to give away to people who share their stuff with us. And who knows where this will lead. I am deeply grateful to Shani for the introduction and to Oscar for being willing to try out stuff in public. And the invitation from him to me to do a second tryout of stuff together. And I just think that's a beautiful model of learning. And I'm really proud to have been part of this with you. So let us know what you think, because we'd really, really love to hear. info@3dcoaching.com. Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com. You're at The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this edition of The Coaching Inn. I'm Claire Pedrick, and today it is my absolute pleasure to be in the good company of Dr. Kathryn Mannix, author of Listen and End in Mind, and also the TED speaker who's done this amazing thing that we've been sharing on socials, What Happens as We Die. Kathryn, welcome.
Claire, thank you so much for inviting me. Great to be with you.
Can I just confess, I am known in the coaching profession for saying, don't guru me. And I don't guru anybody except for you.
Oh, no. I can't be a guru. Oh, hang on. Look, you see, my phone is alarming. Not that it's terrifying. It's simply telling me to make sure that I'm here. But we're already here. No, I can't be anybody's guru. I mean, I can barely run my own life, really. And you will know that thing where there's the person who goes to work, who's the kind of public-facing, client-facing person, and then there's the person who actually lives your life in all its chaotic glory. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. So what I need to tell you is that I don't recommend very many books to coaches, and one of the books that I recommend is your book Listen, because I think it's one of the best book, probably the best book out there about listening.
Goodness. Well, that is such a compliment coming from somebody with your experience and wisdom, Claire. Thank you. I'm really honoured, and I've been surprised, delighted, but surprised at the new readership that this book has picked up compared with the end in mind. Very much is talking to people about dying, and it's largely been picked up by the public or organisations that deal with dying and death and bereavement. But Listen has a whole different new groups of readers, and that I didn't foresee it. Coaches is one of them, and it's being used in training of, I've discovered, police officers and prison officers, and as these new groups declare themselves, you think, actually, yes, how could you possibly do that job if you weren't able to find a way to listen to what's going on, to the people who I'm torn between saying the people who you serve, which I think is the right model, and the people who are in your charge, which is also part of the model that they're working to. Yeah. Listening is absolutely paramount, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I was talking to a nurse yesterday who's using coaching in palliative care, actually. And I was recommending your books to her. And she was saying that when she has conversations in coaching, she talks about the guest. We are a guest in the conversation, which I love, because that's really what you're getting at in Listen, isn't it? That we are a guest in somebody else's life for a bit of time.
Yeah, absolutely right. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you know the answers or that you're in charge.
Exactly. Exactly. I've got a new book coming out in the autumn, and I almost called it "We Offer, They Choose," which is a line which you've probably forgotten, but I talk about that line from Listen all the time. We offer and they choose, because it maybe I like your book because I agree with it. just saying. And it's always good to read something you agree with, right?
Yeah. So what title did you come up with in the end?
It's called The Human Behind the Coach.
Oh, nice. And it's out when?
November.
Good. We can look out for it.
But yeah, I mean, I was listening to Listen on Audible, and I had to get a copy and go through and highlight all the pages, because there's so much in there about human to human encounter. And then you launched your TED Talk.
Yeah, I've had an interesting autumn, really, because I've always thought it would be interesting, although I knew it would also be terrifying, to give a talk at a TED event. And then over the course of the autumn, I had 2 invitations in quick succession, one of which actually was to 2 events back to back, an ordinary, if you like, TEDx event in Dunleary, followed the next day by a youth event. And actually the youth event was absolutely superb. The young people's talks were fantastic, and they've been brilliantly coached and supported by the organizer and her team. Just bringing out the best in them, bringing out their confidence and their ability to stand up and give an account of something that they were knowledgeable about and passionate about. Absolutely superb coaching. And I was invited to cheer everybody up by talking about dying afterwards. And it was a really remarkable event. So now there are 3 talks up on the TED platform, which, goodness me, a year ago I wouldn't have thought that could happen even once, let alone 3 times.
It's so important, isn't it, to be normal about everything.
Yeah. One of the things that I get told a lot is what people find helpful about what I'm doing, because I'm not doing anything extraordinary, really. I'm just talking about stuff that people don't usually talk about.
Exactly.
But the thing that people seem to appreciate about it is, first of all, obviously I'm speaking about dying or communication from a very, very long experience of working with dying people, or facilitating communication in families, or training people to communicate, or being in conversations that matter, either therapeutic conversations or just being a human being. But the thing that people seem to like is the fact that there isn't a special voice for it. Now, in fact, there is a special voice for it, because what I'm doing is I'm using the voice that I practiced for years as a mum, which is, although we're talking about something quite serious here, I'm not using a very serious voice. And my kids recognize that voice with horror, because it means they're in really big trouble.
I love that.
So when they listen to things that are recorded online, they go, "Oh, Mum, I can't believe you're using the voice." But actually, I think it's probably the same voice that I use when I'm trying to make sure that I order the right vegetables at Christmas, and I go into the greengrocers and I go through my list. We're just talking about something, and it matters, but we're not going to get all kinds of emotional and drippy and tip our head to one side and have a very special sad voice. Because that just already that's changing the agenda, isn't it? It's making assumptions about the way the conversation's going to go.
You've just validated my dislike of the diagonal head.
It's a really interesting thing. We laugh about it a lot in palliative care, and there are people who call it the Macmillan tilt. But actually, when you're just in a human-to-human contact with somebody and they're telling you something that makes you feel, oh, I ache for you listening to you telling me this, you will notice that your head tips. And it's not a thing that we do to signal reciprocal emotional something. It's a thing that happens automatically, and I'll quite often find myself in the middle of a conversation with my head over here, and I suddenly think, okay, I've got to get back up to upright without looking as though that's what I'm doing. And so gradually, adjusting by a couple of degrees every few seconds to try and get my head back up to 12 o'clock. So we catch ourselves doing it. And the problem is, of course, that the people who we're talking to find it very, very irritating because they interpret it as pity. But actually, empathy and compassion will move your head in exactly the same direction. So it's about bodily awareness, isn't it? It's trying to, all that spinning plates of communication. What is my voice doing? What words am I choosing? What are you saying? What are you really saying? And also, what body position have I adopted? All at the same time. It's really tough to take notice of all those plates and keep them all spinning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I listened. I read your thing on Twitter, I think it was, about listening to your What Happens As We Die TED thing. So I listened to it for many reasons, partly because I'm very interested in conversations around dying, which is a kind of personal interest as well as a professional interest. I then shared it with my dad, who's 90, and all sorts of other people kind of straight away. But the thing that really struck me from it, Kathryn, is that my definition of coaching is a conversation where somebody feels heard and gets new insights into their own stuff. And as you were describing the conversation with that lady about what dying looked like, that's what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
you're right.
You're right.
She was feeling heard and getting new insights.
Yeah, I never really thought that the job is death coaching before, but it actually is. And we already, I very often compare the parallels between what happens at the very beginning of life and what happens at the very end of life. It's not hard at all to accept that midwives are doing birth coaching. That's exactly what the job is, isn't it? It's about the health of the pregnant person. It's about the health of the baby or babies. And it's about how to do giving birth. It's coaching in order to not exhaust yourself discovering at the last minute stuff that you could have known about, mentally rehearsed, physically rehearsed in advance. And actually now, okay, so now you've moved my head with that explosion of insight. The other thing I realize that we do that's very helpful, which is another type of rehearsal, is for families who are looking after a person who they hope will be able to die in the place where they're currently living. It might be their own home, it might be in a family member's home, it might be residential care where they're really happily settled, and what they don't want is for them to be lifted out at the last minute through a crisis into an ambulance and off to a hospital where they haven't got familiar people and sounds around them. And one of the things that I very often used to do would be to do a kind of, I would call it a cognitive rehearsal with the family. So we've talked about what dying is probably going to be like, and that gradual onset of tiredness and increasing tendency to sleep, eventually not being asleep but being unconscious, breathing changes that can sound a bit disconcerting. And then talk to the family about, so let's say we get to the stage where the breathing sounds noisy and you might be wondering, is this the thing that they told us about? Or is this not okay? Is this different from the thing that they told us about? How will you deal with that? Let's practice now. Let's do a kind of mental run through of what will you do. So the minute they say, I'll dial 999, think, okay, what's going to happen if you dial 999? And the algorithm that the person's following at the other end of the phone will almost certainly dispatch an ambulance because the person isn't responsive, isn't replying to you. And we're expecting that. They're perfectly safe. They're doing ordinary dying. So let's think about what are the other responses we could make? Where's the other sources of help that we could turn to? And it's the same thing, again, that midwives are doing with birth partners. It's the reason that birth doulas can be so helpful. End-of-life doulas now are a growing thing. I'm a patron of the UK's organisation, End-of-Life Doula UK. Just that wise person, usually a woman, but not always a woman, who's saying, yeah, this is normal, this is okay, this is safe, this is what we're expecting. Yes, this is what usually happens, or this is one of the patterns that usually happens, but who's also able to say, oh, hang on, no, this is not okay now. This thing's unusual. I think this might be distress. We need to get this checked out. We don't want this person to be distressed. You know, pain, for example, is not part of the process of dying. Dying only causes you to lose consciousness. The pain will be coming from whatever the illness is that the person has had, probably has painkillers in the house. We probably know the right dose of painkillers. Maybe they haven't been able to swallow for a little while and their pain is coming back. Maybe they're overdue an injection, whatever. So there's a person who's able to normalize that which is normal. And then also say, oh no, hang on, this now is unusual. And if this is the first time you've accompanied a dying person, why on earth would you know that? And that's why I'm so keen that we all know and understand and recognize and talk about ordinary dying, because between us, even if we've only seen 1 or 2 deaths each, if there are 30 people in a supportive community, then that will be between 30 and 60 deaths between them that they can call upon. And if somebody has been an end-of-life worker, you know, a care worker in residential care, community care worker, somebody who's worked in hospitals or hospices or whatever, they may have seen hundreds or even thousands of deaths. And it's a library of resources to be able to call on.
Isn't that beautiful? The beginning, the birth and the death and the normal cycle of life.
Yeah, and the coaching of people. I love that, Claire. That's great.
And there are end-of-life coaches who work with people from diagnosis to actually say, given that you've got 3 or 6 months or whatever left, or an unknown amount of time left, what are the things that you want to be doing in this time that are going to be the most life-giving for you and the people that you love?
Yeah.
Which is such a different model, isn't it, from the oh no, oh dear, oh help version, which does need to be managed, as you say, but is slightly different.
Well, I think, again, you know, when you have a positive pregnancy test, there's a whole load of emotions there, and they're not all joyful, because every change is a loss as well, isn't it? It's the loss of what was before. And so, again, birth and death, so much in parallel, but that shift after doing the adjustment, oh, okay, so this is what is happening now in my life. Right. Okay. Are we going to do the oh no? Or are we going to have that conversation about, okay, so what really matters most? And that's such a great question, isn't it? Yeah. What matters most to you? Because those are the places now to absolutely put focus when time is precious and there's not a lot of time left. How could we use that time best? And what are the things that are happening that just, you know, you've got the absolute note to school to get out of PE now, haven't you? You choose. You be the captain of this ship, and we can come along, we can crew it for you, we can help you to navigate it, but you have to stay in charge.
Yeah, you have to stay in charge. And yet the desire to help somebody accidentally often changes who's in charge of the ship, doesn't it? By mistake.
Isn't it hard not to help? Yeah. Isn't it just so hard? Don't you find yourself, you know, even as a really experienced practitioner, sitting there thinking, oh, if you could only do this or think about that or try this out. And it's really interesting when I'm training new healthcare professionals and I'm teaching them to listen. And I'm teaching them to use curiosity and questions rather than advice and suggestions. I hear them cheating and doing that thing that's so tempting, which is, oh, I've got to ask a question, but I'll bury my advice in a question. Yeah. Have you ever thought about the possibility that you could is still giving advice? And it's hilarious as you watch people realize that they're doing it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We're not taught to ask questions, are we? As humans?
No, it's interesting. It's almost like we're trained out of asking questions, isn't it? Children are just so curious. They are so filled with curiosity, and it's all questions. And somehow we take that curiosity and we start to tell them that there are places where, you know, this is a classroom now. Your questions are not welcome here. Your silence is required here. And to some extent, everybody else in the classroom can only benefit if what's going on can be heard. But of course, the teachers that we all remember are the teachers who encouraged our curiosity, the teachers who managed to look fascinated by our question, as though it was the first time anybody had ever asked them such a fascinating question. Yeah. And yeah, we need somehow to reinvigorate curiosity and hold on to it for the whole of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yes, and encourage. I'm just thinking about school, where the people in the classroom who ask the question is the teacher, but the teacher asks a question with an expectation of a particular answer, because it's the educative process, isn't it? So who knows what this is, or there's always a right answer rather than it being about exploring. Yeah. So what was your hope for Listen when you wrote it, Kathryn?
That's a really good question. You would think I would know the answer, wouldn't you? But the thing was, I hadn't really intended to write a second book. I came along to just help people to understand ordinary dying by telling stories of the way people live during ordinary dying. And my hope in some way was that just as my grandmother would have understood dying by just being there, looking after people dying at home, and having what was going on explained to her by the older, again, mainly women, probably not only women, but mainly women, who themselves had been trained by the previous generation. And so she knew it by knowing the people and watching what was happening to those people as they died. So when I was trying to think, how could you give that back to the public now that they don't have that experience of looking after people at home? It has to be by them meeting people in the place that they are, doing their living as they're doing their dying, telling a story in a way that makes the person really care about what happens to this person. And that's why I use stories. And I thought that was it. It would go out there. It would be in some libraries. Some of my friends would probably use it. But I kind of done what I came to do. And I hadn't anticipated at all how successful the book would be. My publishers had, and I didn't really believe them, if I'm honest. And then there was this huge response from people, partly about the education about dying, which is kind of the correspondence I was expecting, but also this other correspondence that was, okay, you've convinced me this is something we absolutely have to talk about, but I've got no idea how to start that conversation, whether or not to pick up that conversation. what would happen if I made the person sad? What would happen if I made the person cross? What would happen if I made their family cross? Healthcare professionals saying, well, you know, I might get into trouble, I might get sued. And then dying people writing to me saying, I am desperate to have this conversation with my family and they keep closing me down and I don't know how to open it up. And I thought, you know what, I've got quite a lot to say about these conversations. So I went back to my publishers and said, look, I think I've got a book in me that's about communication. And what's really obvious from most of these letters is the tone of, if I could just give this person a really good talking to, we could thrash this thing out and sort it, which is absolutely the cart before the horse, because the key thing is shutting up and listening. So I'd like to write a book about communication, and it will be called Listen. And they never argued about the title. What they did argue about was they came back and said, well, yes, that would be marvellous. We'd love you to write another book, but it mustn't just be about dying. We don't want another death book. And I thought, oh, that's a bit awkward, really, isn't it? Because that is what I know best. And then I stopped and thought about it and thought, no, it's not the only thing I know, of course, because I've had a cognitive therapy practice that was largely, but not exclusively, palliative care. And, you know, I've lived a life, been a trainer, I've managed services and people, and run a home and live in a family and have friends. All those times when there are conversations where you think, oh, I really shouldn't tiptoe around this. This thing really needs to be talked about, but I do wish somebody else would start the conversation and not me. Or I wonder if that person even realises the effect of the way they're behaving on everybody else. I wish somebody would mention it to them. Those kinds of things, those daunting conversations. So I think in the end they were right that it is a better book for being across life's span. And my hope for it really was that it would do the thing that I'd been asked to do, which was help people who were daunted by conversations about serious illness, dying, death, grief, bereavement, to navigate those conversations. But even as I was writing it, I could feel that the premise was growing, that although I was describing a skill set that I had witnessed and I had used principally for those sorts of conversations, that actually what was happening was a distillation of why conversations work in the first place. And I was really helped by conversation analysis expertise. So I got the contract to write the book in January of 2020 with 12 months to deliver the book. And it was 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So although I'd written the proposal, I just then I was completely unable to write as I was watching what was happening across China. It was starting to happen in Italy. COVID cases were rising. We were hearing from our colleagues in Italy about the health service overwhelm. We knew it was coming. And I just thought, I can't sit at home and write a book and sit on, 30 years of experience of helping people who are sick enough to die. So I went back to work. And so first of all, I volunteered for NHS England, and that brought me back into contact with Professor Ruth Parry from Loughborough University, who's a conversations analysis expert, who helped a small group of us doing a project for NHS England to develop a training package, a very quick, easy to digest training package for those daunting conversations. How do you break unwelcome news? How do you discuss when cardiopulmonary resuscitation, when CPR isn't going to be helpful for someone? So you make a certificate to protect them from that. How do you have that conversation so people don't think that they're being deprived of treatment that would help, rather than protected from treatment that won't help? And so we devised a training package. I then went back into the NHS. Because I was over 60, they wouldn't let me be patient facing, which was an interesting emotional response of being really disappointed and incredibly relieved at the same time. But doing staff support and running a communication skills training for newly qualified doctors, newly qualified nurses about these tender conversations, explaining about dying, breaking unwelcome news. And by the time we'd run this training 3 or 4 times, we were having requests from all over the place to run it for them. And eventually we had, very senior intensive care unit staff, respiratory professionals, people who I wouldn't have thought would need that training, but who felt that they could benefit maybe just from having a structure around it because they were having to do it so often. And it was such an emotional burden for them. So I stayed doing that until our first wave had passed locally, which was probably July or August. So now I've only got 5 months to deliver a book. It was going to take a year to write, but I've been doing the practical for months. I've been thinking about what makes these conversations work and coaching people in small groups around conversations and observing the things that they do well and the things they struggle with and the messages that they struggle to hear from the coach. And so actually the book was so much richer for having that expertise distilled into it than it would have been if I just sat down to write it from January.
Thank you. I notice that watching other people having conversations is a huge source of learning.
Yeah,
for me too.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, isn't it? And some of the time it's startling that they don't take the very obvious route in front of them, that they kind of embroider their way into a very difficult backwater. And it's really interesting trying to unravel what was happening for them, that seemed like the obvious route for them when there was something that was as wide as an open barn door that I could see, and either they couldn't or they didn't like the dark that was on the other side of that, so they weren't going to go there even they could see it was open. Fascinating.
And I think there's something, isn't there, about the time delay between seeing what you describe as the open barn door. So we see the open barn door and we think, oh no, I need to say something here that's about listening. Now let me think about what that might be. And all that creates a big time delay. So by the time we offer back our invitation, it's half a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds after the door was opened. And now we're slightly out of sync. And I think that's why it sounds weird.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll have to go away and think about that. Because one of the things that was really interesting about teaching the theory as proper practical practice and then meeting those practitioners again afterwards and then reflecting on how their conversations were going after having attended the training was teaching them the thing we were talking about before, that we're not taught to ask questions, and to encourage them to understand that this isn't like a pain assessment where you've got 7 questions in a row and whatever the answer to question 1 is, question 2 will still be question 2. This is a completely different model of communication. Your opening question is the only question that you will dream up from inside your own head. That after that, your next question explores what the person told you in response to your first question. So you don't know what the question is. You have to think about what they've said to work out what you need to further understand. Do you need to take it wider? Do you need to go in a bit deeper? And that means there'll be a delay between when they stop talking and when you start talking again. And you call that silence. In fact, you call that awkward silence. And what they observe is you thinking about what they just said. What they observe is that you are listening, that you are participating, if they observe it at all. Because we know, don't we, from audio taped and videotaped practice sessions, that we'll have a person who's being trained come out and say, oh, there was that terrible silence, or You know, she said that thing and I couldn't even think what to say next. And how long do you think the silence was? Oh, it was forever. It must have been, I don't know, it felt like half a minute. So now we replay the tape and there is a silence, and it is 5 seconds maybe, which feels like a very long time, doesn't it? And then the patient will say, I didn't even notice that silence. I was absolutely caught up with thinking about what it was that you'd made me think about and asked me about. I didn't notice that silence at all. So helping people to understand that silence is your friend, that silence is thinking time, that this person isn't sitting looking at you thinking they're too stupid to say anything. They are still in their own head thinking about, have I given them everything that I should have done here? Is there anything else I could say? Or they're joining dots because you've helped them to say something out loud that they've never said out loud before. And now they're thinking, oh, and maybe that is because of this, which is related to that. They are not attending to your silence. They are doing their own work in a space that you are providing by holding a silence for them. That's such a new concept to clinicians who've been trained to always know the answers and to use questions only as assessment tools for a medical model of a problem.
I think I agree with you about medical people, but I think it goes way beyond, Kathryn, because what I observe is that people don't look when the silence is happening. So they lose connection with what the silence is doing, which I think is really interesting. So one of the things that we teach coaches is to watch. And I was doing a supervision the other day, and it's a group supervision, and we do what the person who's brought their thing needs most. And what they needed most in the 20 minutes they had was that nobody else spoke at all. But what I observed was that that as a group, most of the participants in the group were not watching them. Most participants in the group were thinking about their own question or working out what they needed to say next, or thinking about being useful or helpful or whatever, and then wanted to offer it without looking back to see whether the person who was holding the space, as it were, was ready for the next thing. So I think timing is a huge lesson that we need to learn as a society.
Yeah. And I love the idea that we're observing the person we're supporting, because if we don't observe them, we will walk all over them completely inadvertently, won't we?
Yeah.
So I think helping people to be comfortable that silence is a tool. So you don't need to be uncomfortable when there's silence in a conversation. But silence doesn't mean that nothing is happening. That the person we're supporting is doing a lot of work in this silence. And if you haven't got something particular to say or to offer or to ask right now, you are still working because you are observing. And what, just teaching people to notice the tiny little bits of body language that tell us that the person we're talking to is still thinking, is remembering, is synthesizing, is starting to feel anxious about the silence now. That kind of look towards you with their eyes that's expectant. Are you going to say something now? And how you can indicate by your response to that eye flick of leaning forwards as though to speak, or to lean back and to look down and basically say, I'm conceding the floor to you. I know it's my turn in this conversation, but actually I'm not going to throw the dice this time. I'm giving it back to you. And it's up to you whether you speak or are silent, but I'm going to wait until you're ready. And you can't do any of that, which is really nuanced, often unspoken body language between two people, if you're not absolutely observing the person. And we have this, I don't know whether it's a British thing or whether it's a human thing, of tending to look away from a person who's looking distressed, when actually that's the very point where we do need to be literally keeping an eye on them.
Talk to you all day. There are so many things that are so similar in the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing. It's really exciting. Thank you, Kathryn, so much for coming and opening up the conversation about listening.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Lovely to meet you and a great honour to join you in your virtual bar.
Thank you for coming. So, listeners, if you want to read Kathryn's book, it's called Listen, by Kathryn Mannix, published by William Collins, and the TED Talk is What Happens as We Die, and it's on YouTube. Thank you, Kathryn, and thank you for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.